And welcome everybody, Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful Apologetics Dojo. And Father Chris, welcome to Hands-On Apologetics.
Thank you, Gary. Sorry, I didn't realize my camera had the top of my head cut off. So sorry about that.
No problem. Hey, those watching on live feed, I'm sure they wish that my camera was doing that. So it's great to have you on board.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, Father, it's funny because my brother was putting together a list of YouTube videos that he wanted to give to some friends who were struggling with their belief in God. And he suggested yours, and I watched your video on the Shroud of Turin, and I thought it was exceptional. So thank you so much for doing that.
Oh, thank you. It is a beautiful relic of our faith that science has done everything to try to disprove. And, you know, it's just like the Bible itself, with everything from Adam and Eve, where, you know, genetically now we've proven that all living human beings can be traced back to one common ancestor, to the evidence of a great flood 5,000 years ago that suddenly swept over the Black Sea, where Noah would have been, you know, all the way to the fact that a person could be swallowed by a sperm whale, and Jonah was in the Mediterranean, and science said, well, there's no way that could have been true because there are no whales in the Mediterranean. Well, they found out that actually there used to be, and the Romans hunted them to extinction. Wow. The bottom line is you can't find anywhere where science has disproven the Bible. And I think it's the same way with the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hey, why don't we start at the beginning? What exactly is the Shroud of Turin?
Well, it's interesting because the Shroud of Turin in our Catholic or our Christian tradition is the burial cloth of Christ. And we know that in so many traditions in our Christian or Catholic faith, it takes just that, faith. And what a lot of people say is, well, show me the scientific evidence. Well, there's been no disproving of the scientific evidence, but what the relic of something like the Shroud of Turin does is it gives us an opportunity to bridge the gap between scientific empirical evidence and a faith in things unseen. And that's basically what it is. It's having a faith in things unseen. And so with the Shroud of Turin, we have an excellent example of what we believe to be the burial cloth of Christ. It's a burned image of a man about 5'10", 5'11", about 175 pounds, that, and depending on the time we have, that they have actually been able to show, to place it in a time and location that was commensurate with Christ being crucified in Jerusalem in the first century. So this is the beautiful, you know, what I keep calling a relic of our faith, but it's more than that. I think it's a living icon, like the image of divine mercy, because we have in it the image of Christ, and the science tells us that that's not painted. You know, the image is not made of brush strokes or any kind of pigment like paint. In fact, it can't be duplicated. And they said the only thing that could have made such an image was a great burst of light. And when we think of the resurrection, what would be the first thing that comes to our mind is a great burst of light. Yeah. And so this is all in many, many ways faith meeting reason. And that's exactly what we have in our Catholic tradition.
Yeah, fantastic point. So the image itself can't be reproduced. It's definitely not a painting. It's a burned image, so to speak, or that there must have been a tremendous explosion of energy to create the image.
Exactly.
It's very tangential, isn't it? Like it's not very detailed, at least to the naked eye. Yeah.
And, you know, the whole powerful message in this is it does take faith to believe in it. You know, we don't have official papers that came with it that said that it goes back to this time and place of Christ's crucifixion. But, it really kind of does, in the sense that they found pollen on the cloth, and that pollen goes back centuries. In fact, some of the plants that produced the pollen that were found on the shroud went extinct in the 1st century. So how could that pollen of a plant that went extinct in the 1st century be on the shroud? That would mean that it had to have been in existence at least in that time frame, or otherwise that pollen wouldn't have, continued, without explanation. And so we know that it can be placed to traced to the place of Jerusalem, in the sense that it was, it contains some pollens that are only native to Israel. And in fact, some of those plants that the pollen was discovered only bloom in the springtime, and some of those plants are only known to be in the Holy Land region. And so I think you could safely say that through science, we've placed it into the area where Christ would have been. Now, what about the time? Well, again, some of the plants were 1st century plants that went extinct. But one of the better arguments I've read and learned about, I know the Jacksons, who do a lot of the research on the shroud out in Colorado, and they came to our house actually and did a presentation on the shroud. And what's fascinating is they actually blew up an image of the face with the NASA VP8 image analyzer. And when they blew up an image on the face, they actually were able to see 2 coins placed in the eye sockets. Now, the reason that coins were placed back in the ancient times was because of rigor mortis. A body would have some after effects after death of rigor mortis, and sometimes the eyes, could you imagine you're at a funeral and the eyes all of a sudden open up. And so they would place coins on the eyes. Now, what's fascinating about this particular image, which we believe is Jesus Christ, is when they blew up the image, they could actually see the inscription on the coins in the eye sockets of this image. And believe it or not, you can read this up. The Jacksons have spoken about this and others. The image that's on those coins actually are coins that were produced and minted under the authority of Pontius Pilate. And that particular coin had a design that they know from historical records was a design that was minted under Pontius Pilate between 29 and 32 AD, which means those coins would have been in circulation at the time of Christ's crucifixion. That would be like you walking around with a quarter in your pocket that was minted 3 years ago. And these coins were laid in the eye sockets, and they were able to blow that up and see it. So what an amazing, amazing story.
Yeah, so you got 2 data points that point to the same general time and area of the pollen, and also the images of the coin.
Yes.
That's fascinating. You mentioned this, and maybe, I don't know if we have enough time. We could certainly pick it up on the other side of the break. But blowing up the face with that imager, that's another very interesting feature of the shroud, is that it's not just a 2-dimensional image. It encodes depth as well.
Yeah, the 3D imagery was captured again by that NASA VP8 image analyzer. And what they said is every image has, depending upon how it's taken, either 2D or 3D information. And what they found was that this image, when analyzed, actually contains 3D imagery information, which means that it was formed in a 3-dimensional way as the cloth contoured into the face. That this was not a flat painted, because if you were to take the image of a cloth and paint it on, it would not form that 3D image of the face. And so for us to see that, it's absolutely incredible. And in fact, the real story of the shroud began in the late 1890s with a professional, I think, photographer named Secondo Pia, who was an Italian photographer. And we know that famous image of the shroud, that there's one that's much lighter and hard to see, and there's one that's it's an inverse, and it's much darker but clearer to the naked eye. And when he took that picture, he was blown away by the fact that when he took the picture, the negative, which when you take, if you remember, you do along with me probably, the old Kodak days. Remember we used to get the negatives inside the picture package, and they would be those ghosted out images, and those were the negatives. And what happens when you take a picture of something, the thing you take the picture of is a positive. So when you take a picture of it, you get a negative. Now, the fascinating thing about the shroud is when they took a picture of it, the Secondo Pia, what he got was a positive. Now, that's unlike anything they ever saw in history and have never duplicated since then. What that means is the thing they took a picture of is actually a negative, which means the negative thing they took the picture of is actually a picture of something. And we believe that, right?
Yep, I hear the music. We're chatting with Father Chris Alar about the shroud. More to come on the other side of the break. And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Father Chris Alar of the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception about the Shroud of Turin. And Father, we're dating ourselves talking about negatives. But you know what's really fascinating, if you think about it, is that what medieval forgery would construct an image that could only be truly revealed by 20th, 21st century technology, with the 3D imaging and even just photography with negatives. They wouldn't have a clue about that stuff in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and as I apologize, I went long on your break there, but when Secondo Pia took the picture and it came back a positive, what that means is what he took the picture of, aka the shroud, is actually a negative. Now, that's impossible because everything you touch is a positive. The cell phone is a positive. And so what that means is what he took a picture of is actually a negative. Well, what does that mean? That means the shroud is a picture of something because itself is a negative. So that means that the shroud is an actual picture of something, and we believe that picture is the image of Christ. It burned an image, if you will, onto that cloth. And you just mentioned Middle Ages. A lot of people came back and said, well, it was a Middle Ages forgery because of that 1988 carbon testing that said the shroud was a hoax. But, Gary, if I could say real quickly, the creator himself of carbon testing said that the test done on the shroud was very shoddy. And because only one sample was taken and it was way too small. And, the people in the Middle Ages held it. There's pictures, there's paintings of people in the Middle Ages holding the image itself. And so their fingerprints, the carbon from your fingers could have gotten onto the edges. And so what happened in the year 2000 is photos of the sample were sent to labs, and they said that these samples were rewoven. And that made sense that the cloth had rewoven parts after that fire. They were added back on after there was a fire in 1532. And that fire, the Jacksons say that test was skewed because of the carbon monoxide. And so another thing is those samples they sent had cotton, gum, and dye, but the main linen of the main body cloth had none of this. So, we look at it, and the head of the team in 1988 later said that the sample that was tested was different from the rest of the cloth. So I think you got to look at that and say, hey, science shows since 2005, all evidence has supported something totally different than what they declared as a hoax.
Yeah, unfortunately, the announcement back in the 80s is that which kind of sticks in people's memory. They remember, oh, it was tested, it was a fraud, we can forget about it. But unfortunately, like the revelations that have happened since then about, like you said, that it's not a pristine sample, it was taken by a non-representative portion of the shroud. Unfortunately, that doesn't have the same mass appeal as that original declaration.
Right. And we have to understand that what went into that original finding was misinformation. It's you can't make an accurate scientific determination based on inaccurate data. So I think it's time that the world knows that we need to relook at what that piece that was tested really was. And that was touched in the Middle Ages by fingers with carbon, and a lot of people said that it was rewoven. So there you go. After the fire of the early 1500s, the nuns sewed swatches back onto it. So I think we have our answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And you point out in the video very nicely that in addition to that, we have evidence that goes earlier than the date that they pointed out in the 1980s test, that of the shroud's existence. So how could the shroud exist before it supposedly was made?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence in writings, even drawings of members of the church holding this herringbone weaved pattern. One of the things that's very important about the weave of the pattern is that weave that we call a herringbone weave was one that they used in very fine linen of the first century in Palestine, a very unique kind of weave. And the Jacksons go so far as to say that this may have also been used as the tablecloth in the Last Supper. And so it's very fascinating because the fine linen that would have been used has this particular herringbone pattern that we have pictures from the 700s, drawings from the 700s that show the same cloth with the same herringbone weave. So right there, the test said it goes back to the 1200s. Well, they have 500 years evidence before that shows people holding that cloth, at least in drawings. We didn't have photographs, but we did have paintings and drawings.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's the shroud is almost like the Energizer Bunny. No matter what people try to throw at it, it just keeps going and going. Carbon testing, all these other things. What other remarkable features are on the shroud?
Well, for me, one of the ones that stood out the most was the image of the man on the shroud. They actually give verification to the same marks and wounds that we read about in the Gospels. So the way that he was scourged, there actually is the marks on the head that would have indicated a crowning with some thorns. Actually, it would have been an entire helmet, not just a wrap around the edge, but more like an entire helmet. And what's interesting is the man on the shroud was both scourged and crucified. Now, the only evidence we have in human history of a man being both scourged and crucified is Jesus Christ. And the reason why is because the ancient Romans, if they were going to crucify someone, they didn't scourge him usually, because he would have been too weak to be able to endure his passion to go through the crucifixion. So they didn't scourge him. Now, for the other criminals that didn't commit a crime as bad, they were usually scourged but not crucified, because they wanted to teach them a lesson, but they didn't deserve full capital punishment. So the interesting thing is this man in the shroud was both scourged and crucified, whereas the only other human in history that we know of that endured both was Jesus Christ. So we have that bit of evidence as well, that I think is extremely powerful piece of information. And the marks, like even in the crucifixion, there's that ongoing argument if he was nailed in the hands or the wrists. And the shroud, which has our Lord's hands folded over, shows the back, and in the wrist there is the mark. Okay, now there's two theories on that mark, because whenever Jesus appears in an apparition and you see his palms, the marks are in the palm, but yet on the shroud, they show up in the back of the wrist. Now there's two arguments for that. There is, and actually even in the front, the argument is that when the blood would have poured down from the mark on the wrist, it could have pooled, in the palm, it could have pooled in the wrist, because there's a natural indentation in both sides of the wrist where blood could have flowed down and pooled, where the rest of the blood dried, but there would have been a pool, a little mark of collected blood. Yeah. But I think the more compelling argument is there is some information now that the way the people were crucified was that the nail was driven through the palm, but at an angle so that it went through the wrist and exited out the back of the wrist.
Interesting.
Because that bone would have held the body on the cross. So it makes perfect sense if we see in the front hand of the images, Christ has his wounds in the palm, but when you see the back of his hand, like on the shroud, we see the wound in the wrist. Because if he was nailed at an angle and it went through the palm at an angle, it would have exited the wrist. And the shroud is commensurate with that. So I find that also to be very valid scientific evidence of how a person would have been crucified that backs the marks that we see on the shroud.
Yeah, that's interesting. So really what we're viewing on the shroud is the exit wound of his hands, yes, not the entrance wounds. Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, so like you said, so you have that correspondence of being tortured and crucified. You have the wound marks, which aren't typical of what we see in depictions of the crucifixion. Also, even the crown of thorns, too, right? Usually it's the small blade of thorns, but they probably just used like a bush, right? A large thorn.
And it would have been easily described as a crown, because crowns then were sometimes the full crowning over the whole head. It wasn't just the crown that went around in a strip. So we could understand why the word crown would have been used, even though it would have been more of the helmet type of design. And that's what the shroud shows. And the shroud shows, even, for instance, in the Divine Mercy image, where we have the blood and the water coming from our Lord's heart, we actually see in the shroud the blood and the water that pooled in the image came from the heart.